I never thought I'd die in a wine cellar surrounded by bottles worth more than my life. But here I was, pressed against the cold stone wall, with my back scraping against centuries-old brick. Marco Valentini's gun pointed directly at my chest, while my tears mixed with the $1,000 Bordeaux I'd just shattered on the floor in my desperate attempt to find something, anything, to use as a weapon or a shield. "Please," I whispered. And I hated how small my voice sounded, how pathetic and broken. But Marco just smiled that cruel smile that had made him the most feared underboss in Chicago. The man who'd personally overseen the elimination of 3 rival families without ever losing a single night's sleep. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, measured, purposeful. And I knew those footsteps the way I knew my own heartbeat. Had memorized the sound of them crossing my penthouse floor in the middle of the night, and everything inside me went still because those were his footsteps, Dante's footsteps, and I didn't know whether that made things infinitely better or catastrophically worse. But let me back up. Because the story of how I ended up staring down the barrel of a gun in a wine cellar worth more than a small country starts 3 hours earlier, when I made the stupidest decision of my entire 26 years of life. I'm Arya Chen, and I've been Dante Salvatore's mistress for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Not that I'm counting or anything, except of course I am, because when you're sleeping with the most powerful and dangerous man in Chicago, you count everything, every moment, every touch, every whispered word in the darkness that you're never quite sure actually meant what you desperately hoped it meant. Not his girlfriend, because girlfriends get introduced to families and taken to dinner and given flowers on their birthdays, and I got none of those things. Not his lover, because that word implies something romantic and mutual and acknowledged in the daylight, and what we had existed only in shadow and secrecy, and the late-night hours when he would show up at my penthouse door with that look in his eyes that was half hunger and half something I was too afraid to name. His mistress, the dirty secret he kept in a luxury apartment on the north side with a view of Lake Michigan, the woman he visited when the weight of his empire became too heavy to bear alone, while his fiancée, the absolutely perfect and perfectly terrible Isabella Moretti, planned their society wedding that was supposed to unite 2 of the most powerful crime families in the entire Midwest. I told myself I was okay with it, had convinced myself over these past 6 months that I could handle the arrangement, that I was sophisticated enough and jaded enough and practical enough to accept the terms of our relationship without wanting more than he could give. The money helped my mother's medical bills, because stage 4 cancer doesn't care about your pride or your moral compass, and the treatments that were keeping her alive cost more per month than I made in an entire year working as a hospital volunteer coordinator. The arrangement was clean, transactional, spelled out in actual paperwork that his lawyers had drawn up, complete with non-disclosure agreements and monthly deposits that appeared in my bank account like clockwork. And I had told myself that made it somehow more acceptable, more businesslike, less like I was selling pieces of my soul every time he touched me. But tonight, standing in my bathroom and staring at the invitation that had somehow ended up in my mailbox, an invitation to Dante's annual charity gala, the biggest social event of the season, the kind of thing that got covered by every society page in Chicago. I made the fatal mistake of wanting more, of letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could exist in his world for one single night. I'd only wanted to see him, to watch him from across a crowded ballroom and remind myself that he was real, and not just some fever dream, not just the man who visited me in darkness and left before dawn, who whispered my name like a prayer when he was inside me but never said it above a whisper, never acknowledged my existence anywhere except in the privacy of my apartment. I wanted to see him in his element, surrounded by his people, being the king of his empire, and I wanted to know if there would be even the slightest flicker of recognition in his eyes when he saw me, even the smallest acknowledgement that I was more than just a transaction in his carefully organized life. So I'd done something incredibly stupid. I'd gone to the gala, had put on the most expensive dress I owned, which he'd bought me, of course, because everything I owned now came from him in one way or another. Had done my makeup and my hair, and had somehow managed to slip past the security at the Salvatore estate by using an invitation that I'd found tucked into one of the care packages he sometimes left at my apartment, though I had no idea if it had been meant for me or if it had simply been mixed in with his things by accident. The estate had been overwhelming in its opulence, all old money and older secrets, with crystal chandeliers that cost more than houses, and artwork that belonged in museums, and enough security to protect a small nation. And I had felt so incredibly out of place among the society women in their designer gowns, and the men in their perfectly tailored tuxedos, all of them part of a world that I would never truly belong to, no matter how much money Dante deposited in my account. But I'd spotted him across the ballroom, impossibly handsome in his black tuxedo, with his dark hair perfectly styled, and his presence commanding the entire room, even though he was just standing there talking to a group of older men who I recognized from news articles as the heads of various crime families. And my heart had done this stupid, painful thing in my chest because, God help me, I was in love with him, had been falling in love with him since the very first night when he'd shown up at my door, and instead of immediately taking me to bed, he'd noticed the hospital paperwork on my kitchen counter, and had asked about my mother with genuine concern in his eyes. I'd been watching him from behind a column, trying to work up the courage to approach, or maybe just trying to memorize the way he looked when he smiled at something one of the old men said, when I felt her presence before I saw her. Isabella Moretti, his fiancée, appearing beside me like a perfectly coiffed avenging angel in a white gown that probably cost more than my mother's entire year of medical treatments. "You must be her," she'd said, and her voice had been cold enough to freeze the champagne in my glass, each word enunciated with the kind of precision that came from years of private schools and etiquette lessons. "The mistress. The little charity case that Dante keeps in that pathetic apartment on the north side." I'd opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, or maybe to apologize, though I wasn't even sure what I would be apologizing for exactly. But before I could form words, a hand had closed around my upper arm with bruising force, and I'd found myself being dragged away from the ballroom by Marco Valentini, Dante's underboss and oldest friend, the man who'd been by his side for 15 years, and who looked at me now with absolute contempt burning in his dark eyes. "You're the whore," he'd said as he pulled me down a hallway away from the party. And it wasn't a question, but rather a statement of fact, delivered with the same casual tone someone might use to comment on the weather. "Dante's gotten sloppy, letting you show up here like you have any right to be in this house, like you're anything more than a warm body he pays for when he needs to forget about the weight of the crown he wears." I'd tried to pull away, had stammered something about leaving, about it being a mistake. But Marco's grip had only tightened as he'd dragged me through a door and down a set of stone stairs that descended into darkness. And I'd realized with growing horror that we were going into the wine cellar, the famous Salvatore wine cellar that housed one of the most valuable private collections in the world. The cellar had been cool and dark, lit only by soft amber lights that made the bottles lining the walls gleam like jewels, and under any other circumstances, I might have found it beautiful, might have appreciated the history contained in this underground vault. But Marco had shoved me against the wall hard enough that my head had cracked against the stone, and then he'd pulled out a gun. And suddenly, the beauty of the cellar had transformed into the terror of a tomb. "Nothing personal, sweetheart," he'd said, and the gun had looked enormous in his hand, black and deadly and so incredibly final. "But the Salvatore Empire can't fall because the boss can't keep his dick in his pants, and that's exactly what's going to happen if the families find out that he's so obsessed with his mistress that he's jeopardizing the Moretti alliance." I'd fought then, had screamed and clawed and knocked over an entire case of vintage wine in my panic, and the bottles had exploded against the stone floor like grenades, red liquid spreading across the ancient stones in pools that looked disturbingly like blood, like a preview of what my blood would look like in just a few moments when Marco pulled the trigger. The sound of breaking glass had been deafening in the enclosed space, and the smell of expensive wine had filled my nostrils, and I'd pressed myself against the wall and whispered, "Please," even though I knew that men like Marco didn't respond to pleading, didn't have mercy switches that could be activated by tears or desperation. That's when I'd heard the footsteps on the stairs, when everything had changed in the space of a single heartbeat. Dante had appeared at the top of the staircase like an avenging angel, or maybe like the devil himself, and his eyes had met mine for a split second. Those dark, fathomless eyes that I'd gazed into while he moved inside me, that had looked at me with something that might have been tenderness in the quiet moments after. And in that second, I'd seen something flicker across his face that I'd never seen before, something raw and terrified and absolutely murderous. Then his eyes had shifted to Marco, and his entire demeanor had changed, had become cold and calculating, had transformed him into the Mafia Don that ruled Chicago with an iron fist. And when he spoke, his voice had been quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that preceded violence and death. "Put the gun down, Marco," he'd said, and each word had been delivered with the precision of a blade finding vital organs. Marco had actually laughed, had kept the gun trained on my chest while he'd turned slightly to address his boss, his friend, his brother-in-arms. "Boss, I'm doing this for you, for the family, for everything we've built together over the past 15 years, he'd said. And there had been something almost pleading in his voice, as if he needed Dante to understand, to approve, to recognize that he was making the hard choice that Dante himself couldn't make. "She's a liability, a weakness that our enemies will exploit, and the families are already talking, already questioning your judgment, because you've been seen leaving her apartment, because you're distracted and sloppy, and acting like a man in love instead of a man who rules an empire." Dante had descended one step, and the movement had been slow and deliberate, and somehow more threatening than if he'd rushed down the stairs in a rage. Then another step, and another. And Marco's hand had started to shake just slightly, had betrayed the first hint of fear. Because even though he'd been Dante's right hand for 15 years, even though they'd built this empire together and survived 3 separate gang wars and eliminated rivals without hesitation or remorse, he was beginning to realize that he'd made a terrible miscalculation. When Dante spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper that had made my blood freeze in my veins despite the fact that I wasn't the target of his fury. "I won't ask again, Marco," he'd said. And there had been a promise in those words, a guarantee of violence and retribution that had filled the wine cellar like poison gas. The temperature in the wine cellar dropped what felt like 20 degrees in the span of a single breath, and I watched as Marco's face transformed from confident righteousness to something that looked disturbingly like the dawning realization that he'd just made a mistake that couldn't be unmade, that he'd crossed a line that he hadn't even known existed until this very moment when Dante stood on those stairs, looking like death incarnate wrapped in an expensive tuxedo. I'd never seen Dante like this before, not cold in the way that ice is cold, but glacial in the way that ancient things buried deep in the earth are cold, in the way that absolute zero is cold, with a fury so controlled and so complete that it was almost beautiful in its terrible precision. And he was a completely different man from the one who whispered my name in the darkness of my bedroom, who traced the curve of my spine with reverent fingers, who sometimes looked at me like I was something precious and breakable that he was terrified of damaging. Marco kept the gun trained on me, but his hand had definitely started to shake now, trembling just enough that I could see the slight movement of the barrel, and he was breathing faster, his chest rising and falling with increasing rapidity as Dante continued his slow, measured descent down the stone stairs. "Dante, you need to think about this clearly. Think about what's at stake here," Marco said, and his voice had taken on a desperate edge that made him sound almost like he was begging, pleading for understanding from a man who had clearly moved beyond the reach of reason or negotiation. "Isabella's father will withdraw his support if he finds out about her, about this woman, and the Moretti alliance is everything we've worked toward for the past 3 years, everything that will finally give us control over the entire Midwest territory, and end the constant threat of war with the other families. Everything. Dante's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass, sharp enough to draw blood, and it echoed off the stone walls of the cellar in a way that made it sound like there were multiple versions of him surrounding us, all of them equally dangerous and equally beautiful in their rage. You want to talk to me about everything, Marco, about what matters and what doesn't, about the empire we've built and the sacrifices we've made? The gun lowered, but only barely, only by the smallest fraction of an inch, and Marco's face was a study in pure confusion, in the kind of bewilderment that comes from having your entire understanding of a person completely overturned in a matter of seconds. He'd been Dante's right hand for 15 years, had been there from the very beginning, when Dante had taken over the family business from his father, had survived 3 separate gang wars and countless attempts on their lives, had helped eliminate rivals and consolidate power and build an empire that stretched across 5 states, and in all that time, he thought he'd known exactly who Dante was, and what he valued, and what he would sacrifice to maintain his position at the top of the food chain. "You're choosing a whore over the family?" Marco spat, and the word hit me like a physical blow even though I'd heard it before, had heard it whispered behind my back and sometimes to my face, had learned to accept it as the price of the choices I'd made. "You're going to throw away everything we've built, 15 years of blood and sacrifice and careful planning, for a woman you pay to fuck." The gunshot that followed was so sudden and so loud in the enclosed space of the wine cellar that I screamed, actually screamed in a way that I'd never heard myself scream before, a sound of pure terror that came from somewhere deep in my chest. But it wasn't me who'd been shot. Wasn't my blood joining the spilled wine on the ancient stone floor. Marco's gun clattered to the ground as he grabbed his hand, blood streaming between his fingers from where Dante's bullet had torn through flesh and possibly bone. And I hadn't even seen Dante draw his weapon, hadn't registered the movement of his hand reaching for the gun that must have been holstered beneath his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket, because he was just that fast, just that practiced in the art of violence and death. "She has a name," Dante said, and his voice was still quiet, still controlled. But now there was something else underneath it, something that sounded almost like pain, like the words were being dragged out of him against his will. He walked past Marco like he was nothing more than a piece of furniture, like he was completely inconsequential and unworthy of attention. And his eyes never left my face as he crossed the wine-stained floor, his expensive shoes leaving footprints in the red liquid that looked disturbingly like he was walking through blood. "And you'll never speak it, never say it, never let it pass your lips again, and you'll never look at her, never breathe the same air as her, never exist in the same space as her for as long as you live, which might not be very long at all if you don't get the fuck out of my sight in the next 10 seconds. Marco clutched his bleeding hand against his chest, and his eyes were wild with betrayal, with the kind of hurt that comes from being rejected by someone you considered closer than a brother, someone you'd have died for without hesitation. "The Morettis will come for you when they find out," he said, and his voice was thick with pain and shock and something that might have been grief. "Isabella's father will consider this a personal insult, a violation of the engagement agreement, and he won't rest until you're dead and buried and your entire family is destroyed." "Let them come," Dante said, and the casualness with which he delivered what was essentially a declaration of war made my blood run cold, made me realize exactly how much danger we were both in, how catastrophic the consequences of this moment were going to be. "Let them all come, and I'll show them exactly what happens when someone threatens what's mine." Then he was in front of me, so close that I could smell his cologne mixed with gunpowder, and his hands were cupping my face with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with the violence he'd just committed, his thumbs wiping away my tears with a tenderness that made my chest ache with emotions I couldn't name. "Aria," he said, and my name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like an invocation, like something sacred and precious. "Mia piccola fiamma, my little flame, tell me right now if you're hurt, if that bastard touched you, if he harmed even a single hair on your head." I couldn't speak. Couldn't find words adequate to express the chaos of emotions swirling through me like a hurricane. Couldn't process what had just happened, and what it meant, and what the consequences were going to be. He'd just destroyed a 15-year friendship, had shot his oldest friend and most trusted advisor, had jeopardized what was apparently a multi-million-dollar alliance that had taken 3 years to negotiate, had possibly started a war between crime families that would result in countless deaths and unimaginable bloodshed. And he'd done it all for me. For a woman he paid to be his mistress. For someone who was supposed to be nothing more than a transaction in his carefully ordered life. "Answer me, Arya," he demanded, and his voice cracked. Actually cracked in a way that I'd never heard before, revealing something vulnerable and terrified beneath the controlled exterior of the Mafia Don. "Did he touch you? Did he put his hands on you? Did he hurt you in any way?" "I'm fine," I finally managed to whisper, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and shaky and not quite real. "He pushed me against the wall, but I'm not hurt. Not really. Just scared out of my mind and completely confused about what just happened and why you would do something so incredibly reckless and dangerous." He pulled me against his chest then, wrapped his arms around me like he was trying to absorb me into his body, to make me a part of him that couldn't be separated or threatened or taken away. And I felt his heart hammering against my cheek. Felt the rapid rhythm that betrayed how affected he was despite his outward calm. "What I should have done 6 months ago," he said, and his voice was muffled against my hair. His lips pressed against the top of my head in something that felt almost like a kiss. "What I should have done the very first night when I realized that you were going to be so much more than a transaction. So much more than a convenient arrangement to help with your mother's medical bills." Before I could ask him what he meant, before I could demand answers to the 1,000 questions suddenly flooding my mind, his phone erupted with the sound of multiple incoming calls, the vibrations so insistent and so frequent that it felt like the device was having a seizure in his pocket. He pulled it out with obvious reluctance, his arm still wrapped around me like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go, and I watched as his face transformed from tender concern to grim resignation as he looked at the screen and saw who was calling. The first call was from someone listed simply as Moretti, which I assumed was Isabella's father, Don Moretti himself, the man who controlled the second-largest crime family in Chicago and who had been planning to unite his empire with Dante's through the marriage of their children. The second call was from someone labeled Father, and I felt Dante's entire body tense against me, felt his muscles go rigid with something that might have been fear, or might have been anger, or might have been some complicated mixture of both. The third, fourth, and fifth calls were from names I recognized from news articles and whispered conversations: Lombardi, Russo, Chen, the heads of every major crime family operating in Chicago and the surrounding territories, all of them calling at once like they'd been alerted to some catastrophic event that required immediate attention. Marco had made it to the door of the wine cellar, was stumbling up the stairs with his injured hand still bleeding and leaving a trail of crimson drops behind him, like breadcrumbs in a particularly gruesome fairy tale. And I realized with sinking dread that he was already talking, already spreading the word about what had happened, already poisoning the well and turning the other families against Dante with his version of events. "They know," Dante said, and his voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man who had just watched his entire world catch fire and was calmly calculating the best way to survive the flames. "Marco's already called them, already told them that I chose my mistress over the Moretti alliance, that I shot my own underboss to protect a woman who means nothing in the grand scheme of power and territory and the carefully balanced peace that's existed between the families for the past 5 years. What are we going to do?" I asked, and the "we" slipped out automatically, naturally, as if it was already assumed that whatever came next would involve both of us, that I was somehow part of this now in a way that I hadn't been before, that the transaction had transformed into something else entirely in the space of a single violent moment. Dante looked down at me, and his eyes were dark and fathomless and filled with something that looked almost like wonder, Like he couldn't quite believe I'd used that word. Couldn't quite believe that I was still standing here in his arms instead of running for my life. "Now we run," he said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, as if there was no question about what came next. "We run, and we fight, and we survive because I'm not giving you up. Not now, not ever, not even if it costs me everything I've spent my entire life building." The phone continued to ring, call after call after call, and I could hear sounds from upstairs now, shouting and footsteps, and what might have been gunshots, or might have been doors slamming, and I realized that the estate was erupting into chaos, that soldiers were choosing sides, and families were mobilizing, and the carefully maintained peace was shattering like the wine bottles I'd broken on the floor. Dante grabbed my hand, his grip almost painfully tight, and started pulling me toward a section of the wall that looked exactly like all the other sections of wall, covered in the same ancient stone and the same soft amber lighting. "There's a tunnel," he said, and he was pressing stones in a sequence that must have been some kind of code, and a section of the wall began to swing inward with the grinding sound of mechanisms that probably hadn't been used in decades. Built during Prohibition when my great-grandfather was running bootleg liquor and needed escape routes in case of raids, and it runs all the way to the city, comes up in an abandoned warehouse on the south side that hasn't been used for legitimate business in probably 50 years. The tunnel entrance yawned before us like the mouth of some ancient beast, dark and forbidding and smelling of earth and secrets and the accumulated dust of almost a century, and Dante pulled me toward it with urgency that made my heart race even faster than it already was. But before we could step through, before we could disappear into the darkness and whatever future awaited us on the other side, he stopped and turned to me, his hands once again cupping my face, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me feel like he was trying to memorize every detail, every feature, every tiny aspect of my face. "Arya, you need to understand something before we go through that door," he said, and his voice was raw with emotion, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. "Once we step into this tunnel, once we leave this estate, there's no coming back from this. No way to undo what's been done or return to the way things were before tonight. You'll be marked as mine, hunted by every family in Chicago. Your life as you knew it completely and irrevocably over, and everyone you've ever cared about will become a target that my enemies will use to get to me." I looked at the man who had just declared war on 2 crime families for me, the man who had shot his oldest friend rather than let harm come to me. The man I'd tried so desperately hard not to fall in love with, because I'd known from the very beginning that loving him would complicate everything and probably destroy me in the end. His face was beautiful in the amber light of the wine cellar, all sharp angles and dark eyes, and the kind of dangerous charisma that had probably gotten countless women into trouble throughout history. And I realized that I'd already made my choice, had probably made it 6 months ago when I'd first opened my door to him and seen something in his eyes that had called to something in my soul. "Then let's go," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected, stronger and more certain than I'd thought possible given that my entire life was literally falling apart around me. Because whatever is waiting for us on the other side of that tunnel, whatever hell we're about to walk into, it has to be better than a life where I have to pretend that I don't love you with every single piece of my broken, terrified, absolutely insane heart. His expression transformed into something that I'd never seen before, something that looked like relief and joy and terror all mixed together into an emotion so intense that it was almost painful to witness. And he kissed me then, not with the careful control he usually maintained or the practiced seduction he'd used during our first encounters, but with desperate hunger and overwhelming need and something that felt terrifyingly close to worship. The kiss tasted like wine and gunpowder and the salt of tears, though whether they were his or mine I couldn't tell. And it felt like a promise and a goodbye and a beginning all at once. Felt like we were sealing something between us that could never be broken no matter what horrors awaited us in the darkness of that tunnel. We pulled apart only when the sounds from upstairs became impossible to ignore, when the shouting grew louder and more urgent, and we heard what was definitely gunfire now. Sharp cracks that echoed through the estate like thunder. And Dante's face went grim as he realized that whatever was happening up there had escalated beyond the point of peaceful negotiation. He pulled his phone out one more time, looked at the screen that was still lighting up with incoming calls from every powerful person in Chicago, and then he did something that made my blood run cold. He turned it off completely, cutting off all communication with the outside world, severing every connection to the empire he'd spent his entire life building. "Stay close to me," he said as he pulled me into the darkness of the tunnel, as the door began to swing shut behind us and seal us into the earth like we were being buried alive. "No matter what happens next, no matter what we face or who comes after us, stay close to me and trust that I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone take you from me." The door closed with a final, decisive thud that echoed in the tunnel like a death knell. And we were plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that felt alive and suffocating. And I could hear Dante fumbling for what must have been a flashlight or some kind of light source. When the beam finally flickered to life, illuminating the tunnel that stretched ahead of us into what looked like infinity, I saw his face in the harsh white light, saw the determination and fear and absolute conviction written there, and I realized that we'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, that whatever we'd had before, the carefully maintained transaction, the illusion of emotional distance, the pretense that this was just business, was completely and irrevocably gone. Behind us, muffled by stone and earth and a century of accumulated secrets, we heard the first explosion as something in the estate erupted into flames, heard the screams and the gunfire and the sounds of a world tearing itself apart. And Dante's hand tightened around mine as he began pulling me deeper into the tunnel, away from the fire and the blood and the empire he'd just sacrificed on the altar of whatever this thing between us had become. The tunnel smelled like mold and century-old secrets and the accumulated weight of too many years spent sealed away from sunlight. And with every step we took deeper into the darkness, I could feel the estate behind us burning, could almost hear the screams and gunfire even though we were probably already too far underground for sound to reach us. And I kept thinking about how my entire life had been completely upended in the space of less than an hour. How I'd gone from being a kept woman with a comfortable arrangement to being a fugitive running through a Prohibition-era tunnel with a man who had just declared war on half of Chicago's criminal underworld. Dante's hand was wrapped around mine with a grip that bordered on painful, his fingers interlaced with mine in a way that suggested he was afraid I might disappear if he loosened his hold even slightly, and he pulled me forward through the darkness with the flashlight beam bouncing off dirt walls and ancient timber supports that looked like they might collapse at any moment, like they'd been waiting decades for an excuse to finally give up and bury whatever poor souls happened to be passing through. I'd never been to Dante's real home before this disastrous evening. Not the penthouse where he sometimes stayed in the city. Not any of the safe houses he maintained throughout Chicago. But the actual Salvatore family estate where he'd grown up, and where he was supposed to have married Isabella Moretti in 3 weeks' time, in what would have been the society wedding of the decade. The little I'd seen of it before Marco had dragged me to the wine cellar had been overwhelming in its opulence and old-world grandeur. All marble floors and priceless artwork, and the kind of wealth that had been accumulated over generations through means that probably didn't bear too close examination, and now that beautiful estate was burning, was being torn apart by gunfire and family politics, and the consequences of Dante's choice to protect me instead of protecting his empire. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through the earth like a snake, occasionally branching off into side passages that disappeared into darkness and made me wonder where they led. What other secrets the Salvatore family had buried beneath Chicago over the past century. My feet were killing me because I was still wearing the ridiculously expensive heels I'd put on for the gala. The ones that had seemed like a good idea when I was imagining myself gliding across a ballroom floor, but were absolutely terrible for running through underground tunnels, and I could feel blisters forming with every step. Could feel the straps cutting into my skin. But I didn't dare complain because Dante looked so focused, so grimly determined, like he was calculating our chances of survival with every breath, and the numbers weren't coming up in our favor. We finally emerged what felt like hours later, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, coming up through a trapdoor in the floor of what was indeed an abandoned warehouse on the south side, exactly as Dante had promised. And the building smelled like decades of disuse and rat droppings and industrial chemicals that had probably been illegal even when the place was operational. Dante pulled out his phone, a different phone than the one he'd turned off back at the estate, I realized, because of course he had multiple phones, probably multiple identities, multiple everything that a man in his position would need to survive, and made 3 quick calls to people he referred to only as the Greek, Father Tony, and Sal, speaking in rapid-fire Italian that was too fast and too colloquial for me to follow with my limited knowledge of the language. Within what seemed like an impossibly short amount of time, maybe an hour at most, we had what Dante called a temporary situation handled, which apparently meant that we had a safe house on the north side, weapons that were being delivered by a man who looked like he could bench press a car, and a terrifying reality that was settling over me like a shroud as I sat on an overturned crate in the warehouse and watched Dante orchestrate our survival with the efficiency of someone who had probably done this kind of thing before. We were at war, actual war, not the metaphorical kind, but the type that involved bullets and bodies, and the very real possibility that we might not survive to see another sunrise. And the weight of that realization was making it difficult to breathe, making my chest feel tight and my hands shake with delayed shock from everything that had happened in the wine cellar. "I need you to understand something," Dante said as we climbed into the nondescript sedan that Father Tony had delivered, a car that looked like it had seen better days but probably had bulletproof windows and armor plating and all sorts of modifications that weren't visible to the casual observer, and he was driving us through the dark Chicago streets, toward whatever safe house his people had secured, while constantly checking the mirrors like he expected to see pursuing vehicles at any moment. "The Morettis aren't going to let this go, aren't going to accept that I've broken the engagement and chosen you over their alliance, and they're going to send everyone they have after us. Professional killers, mercenaries, maybe even dirty cops that they have on their payroll. And they'll go after your mother, your friends, anyone you've ever cared about or spent time with, anyone they think they can use as leverage to get to you, or to get to me through you." My blood went cold. Actually went cold in a way that I'd thought was just an expression until that moment when I felt ice spreading through my veins at the thought of my mother, sick and fragile and completely defenseless in her hospital bed, becoming a target in this war that I'd inadvertently helped start. "My mother?" I said, and my voice came out strangled, panicked, higher pitched than normal as terror gripped my throat. "Dante, she's at Northwestern Memorial. She's completely vulnerable. She can't defend herself. She doesn't even know about you or about any of this, and if they go after her—" "Already handled," he interrupted, and his voice was calm, assured, the voice of a man who had thought several steps ahead while I was still processing step 1. "I moved her to a private facility 3 hours ago, around the time you were arriving at the gala, actually. Had my people transfer her under an assumed name to a place that specializes in cancer treatment, and that has the kind of security that rivals a federal facility. And she thinks she's being moved for better treatment, thinks it's a gift from the hospital foundation you work for, has no idea that she's actually being protected from a potential mob hit." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to understand the implications of the timeline he'd just revealed. And slowly, pieces started clicking into place in my mind like a puzzle assembling itself. "3 hours ago," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper as understanding dawned. "You moved her 3 hours ago, before everything went to hell at the gala, before Marco pulled a gun on me, before you shot your oldest friend and destroyed your alliance with the Morettis." He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force that his knuckles were white in the dim light from the dashboard. And he didn't say anything for a long moment. Just drove through the empty streets like he was trying to outrun his own thoughts. I moved her because I knew that tonight was going to change everything, he finally said, and his voice was rough, raw with emotion that he was barely keeping contained. I knew that I was going to have to make a choice, that I couldn't keep living this double life, couldn't keep pretending that you were just a transaction while planning to marry Isabella, couldn't keep lying to myself about what you'd become to me over these past 6 months. What are you saying? I asked. Though part of me already knew, had maybe always known on some level that I'd refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it would have made everything so much more complicated and terrifying. We pulled up to what looked like a condemned building. All boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls, and the general air of urban decay that suggested no one had legitimately occupied the space in years. But when Dante led me inside through a back entrance that required 3 different keys and a security code, I found myself in what could only be described as a fortress disguised as a ruin. The interior had been completely renovated, reinforced, turned into something that looked like it could withstand a siege, with multiple rooms that were being set up by men I didn't recognize, men who moved with military precision and carried enough weapons to start a small war, which I supposed was exactly what we were doing. I'm saying that I've been in love with you since the first night, Arya, Dante said, and we were standing in what appeared to be the master bedroom of this fortified safe house, and he was looking at me with such intensity that I felt like I might catch fire from the heat of his gaze. Since you walked into that charity hospital where you volunteer 3 days a week, the one where you spend your free time reading to dying children and holding the hands of old people who have no family left, and I realized that the woman I was paying to warm my bed was spending her precious free time doing volunteer work that didn't pay her a single cent. You followed me, I said, and it should have felt like a violation, should have made me angry or scared or both. But instead it just felt like confirmation of something I'd suspected, like another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I've had men watching you since day one, since the very first night when I left your apartment and realized that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life by trying to keep this transactional, he admitted, and he crossed the room to stand in front of me, his hands reaching out to cup my face in that way that was becoming familiar. That gesture that seemed to be his way of grounding himself, of making sure I was real. Not to control you, never to control you or monitor your movements or restrict your freedom, but to protect you. Because I knew from the very beginning that loving you would paint a target on your back, that my enemies would try to use you against me the moment they figured out that you were more than just a convenient arrangement. The door to the bedroom burst open before I could respond, before I could even begin to process this confession that was rewriting everything I'd thought I understood about our relationship. And a young man who looked startlingly like Dante, same dark hair, same sharp features, but younger and with less of the hardness that came from years of ruling a criminal empire, stood in the doorway looking panicked and out of breath. The Morettis are mobilizing, he said without preamble, without even acknowledging my presence beyond a quick glance that assessed and dismissed me in the same moment. Isabella's father is calling for your head, literally calling for your head on a platter, and he's putting out word through all the families that there's a bounty on both of you, $1 million for anyone who brings him proof of your deaths. Luca, Dante said, and his voice was calm, despite the content of what his brother, because this had to be his younger brother, the one I'd heard mentioned in passing but never actually met, had just told us. This is Arya. Arya, this is my brother Luca, who apparently hasn't learned how to knock before entering a room. Luca looked at me properly then, really looked at me, and I saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in my wine-stained dress and disheveled hair, and the fact that I was clearly the woman his brother had just started a war over. You're her, he said, and it wasn't a question but rather a statement of fact, delivered with something that might have been awe, or might have been horror, or might have been some combination of both. The mistress. The woman Marco said was going to destroy everything. Watch your tone, Dante said, and there was warning in his voice, a promise of consequences if his brother said anything else that could be construed as disrespectful. And I watched as Luca's expression shifted from shock to something that looked like confusion, and maybe a tiny bit of fear. Our own soldiers don't know which side to take, Luca continued, clearly deciding that focusing on business was safer than continuing to discuss me. About half are loyal to you personally, would follow you into hell if you asked them to. But the other half are saying that you've violated the sacred rules of family and alliance, that you've put personal desires above the good of the empire, and they're listening to the old men who are saying that you need to be removed as head of the family, for the good of everyone. And father? Dante asked, and I noticed the way his entire body tensed when he said that word, the way his shoulders went rigid and his jaw clenched like he was bracing himself for a physical blow. Luca swallowed hard, and I could see that he didn't want to deliver whatever news he was about to share, could see that it pained him in a way that suggested complicated family dynamics that I couldn't begin to understand. Father says to bring the girl to him, says that he wants to handle this situation personally, says that if you do this one thing, if you let him deal with her, and then go through with the Moretti wedding as planned, he'll smooth everything over with Isabella's father, and we can all move forward like tonight never happened. The translation of what his father wanted was clear even to me, even though I'd never met the man and knew him only through reputation and the few things Dante had mentioned in passing during our 6 months together. He wanted to kill me and make it look like an accident, wanted to remove the problem at its source so that his son could continue building the empire they'd all sacrificed so much to create. The room went very quiet, so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could hear the sound of my own breathing that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. And I waited for Dante to respond, to tell his brother that he would consider his father's proposal, to make the rational choice that would save his empire and his position and everything he'd worked his entire life to build. Tell father, Dante said, and his voice was so cold, so absolutely devoid of warmth or familial affection, that it made me shiver despite the fact that the room was perfectly temperature-controlled, that if anyone touches Arya, if anyone so much as looks at her wrong or thinks about harming her in any way, I will burn the entire Salvatore Empire to the ground, will salt the earth where it once stood, will destroy everything we've built over 4 generations until there's nothing left but ashes and memories. Luca stared at his brother like he'd never seen him before, like Dante had suddenly started speaking a foreign language that he couldn't comprehend, and his mouth actually fell open in shock at the declaration he'd just heard. You would go to war with your own family? He asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with a kind of horrified awe at the implications of what Dante had just said. You would destroy everything that grandfather built, everything that father has maintained, everything that you yourself have expanded and strengthened over the past decade, all for a woman you've known for 6 months? For her, Dante said, and he pulled me against his side, wrapped his arm around my waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective, and he looked at his brother with absolute conviction burning in his dark eyes. For her, I would go to war with God himself, would tear down heaven and storm the gates of hell, would burn every bridge and destroy every alliance and sacrifice every bit of power and prestige and wealth that I've accumulated, because she is the only real thing in my entire life, the only true thing in a world built on lies and violence and blood. That's when we heard it. The first explosion hitting somewhere in the distance, but close enough that the building shook slightly, close enough that dust fell from the ceiling and the windows rattled in their reinforced frames, and Dante's expression transformed from passionate declaration to grim calculation in the space of a heartbeat. Luca ran to the window, careful to stay to the side so he wouldn't be visible from the street, and peered out through the bulletproof glass with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Don Moretti isn't waiting for negotiations or for father to deliver the girl, Luca said, and his voice had taken on the same hard edge that Dante's carried, the voice of someone who had grown up in this world and understood its brutal rules. He's sending a message, making a statement, showing everyone that challenges to his authority and insults to his daughter will not be tolerated. Alarms started blaring then, multiple alarms from multiple systems, and I could hear shouting from other parts of the building as Dante's men mobilized in response to whatever threat was approaching. And the reality of our situation crashed over me like a wave. We were trapped in a building that was about to become a war zone, surrounded by enemies who wanted us dead, cut off from any kind of official help, because we couldn't exactly call the police when we were both part of the criminal underworld that the police were supposed to be fighting against. Dante grabbed my hand again, that same iron grip that suggested he would hold on to me even if the building collapsed around us, even if the world ended and we were the last two people standing in the rubble, and he pulled me toward what looked like a solid wall, but which I suspected was actually another hidden exit, another escape route, because men like Dante always had contingency plans and backup options and ways to survive when everything went to hell. "There's a tunnel," he said, and I almost laughed at the irony of escaping through another tunnel, of our entire relationship apparently being defined by running through underground passages and emerging into uncertain futures. "This one leads to a parking garage 3 blocks away where I have cars stationed, and from there, we can get to another safe house, one that even Luca doesn't know about, one that I've kept secret for situations exactly like this." "But Dante, this is insane," I said, even as I let him pull me toward the wall, even as I heard the sounds of battle erupting outside. Gunfire and explosions and shouting that suggested Moretti's forces had arrived in full strength and were not interested in a prolonged siege. "You can't keep running forever, can't keep fighting your own family and the Morettis and every other crime family in Chicago, can't sustain this kind of war without eventually losing everything." He stopped at the wall, entered a code into a keypad that I hadn't even noticed in the dim light, and turned to look at me with such fierce intensity that I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, like something that could anchor me to the earth or lift me into the sky depending on his will. "I need you to understand something, Arya," he said, and he was cupping my face again. Those strong hands that had killed and protected and built an empire now holding me like I was made of spun glass and might shatter at any moment. "The Morettis will send everyone they have, every soldier and mercenary and hired killer in their considerable arsenal, and they'll come at us with everything they've got because Don Moretti cannot afford to look weak, cannot afford to let anyone think that his authority can be challenged without devastating consequences." "I know," I whispered, because I did know, had understood the stakes from the moment Marco had pointed that gun at me in the wine cellar, had realized that my presence in Dante's life had triggered a catastrophic chain of events that couldn't be stopped or reversed. "But here's what they don't understand," Dante continued, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Dangerous, and beautiful, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. I've been preparing for this possibility for months, have been quietly moving assets and securing loyalties, and building a network of people who are loyal to me personally, rather than to the Salvatore name or the family empire, because I knew that eventually I would have to choose between you and everything else. And I've known which choice I was going to make since the 3rd week of our arrangement, when I realized that I couldn't stop thinking about you, even when I was supposed to be negotiating territory deals and planning strategic alliances." The wall section slid open, revealing yet another tunnel, though this one looked more modern, more recently constructed, with electric lights and concrete walls instead of the dirt and timber of the Prohibition-era passage, and Dante pulled me toward it just as a louder explosion hit. This one close enough that I could feel the heat of it, could smell smoke and burning chemicals and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Luca shouted something in Italian, something that sounded urgent and probably involved curse words that I didn't know, and then he was diving through the tunnel entrance after us, and the wall was sliding shut behind us, sealing us off from the battle that was raging in the safe house we were abandoning. "What are you suggesting?" I asked as we ran through the tunnel, as the sounds of warfare echoed behind us, and Dante's hand remained locked around mine like he would never let go. like I had become as essential to his survival as oxygen or blood, or the beating of his own heart. "I'm suggesting," he said, and we emerged into the parking garage he'd mentioned, where 3 different vehicles sat waiting with engines already running and drivers behind the wheels who looked like they could handle themselves in any situation that might arise. That maybe, just maybe, we don't have to run forever. That maybe we can find a way to end this that doesn't involve either of us dying or me destroying everything I've ever built. I looked at the man who had just sacrificed his empire for me, who had declared war on his own family and the most powerful crime, families in Chicago, who was now suggesting that there might be a way out of this nightmare that didn't end in blood and ashes and devastating loss. And I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just love or determination or fierce protectiveness, but actual hope. The kind of hope that suggested he'd been planning something that went beyond simple survival. That maybe he'd been thinking several moves ahead while everyone else was still reacting to the current crisis. "What kind of way out?" I asked, as we climbed into the middle vehicle, as Dante gave rapid instructions to the driver in Italian that I couldn't follow, as we pulled out of the parking garage and merged into late-night Chicago traffic, like we were just normal people going about normal business instead of fugitives fleeing from a mob war. Dante pulled me close, tucked me against his side in a gesture that was becoming familiar, that made me feel safe even though logically I knew that we were in more danger than we'd ever been in before. And he pressed a kiss to the top of my head before answering, "I'm thinking that maybe the person we need to talk to isn't Don Moretti or my father or any of the old men who make the rules in this world, but rather the one person who has the most to lose from this war continuing and the most to gain from finding an alternative solution, Isabella herself. Because I would bet everything I own that she's just as trapped in this engagement as I was, just as desperate for a way out that doesn't involve disappointing her father or destroying her family's reputation. The safe house where we finally stopped running was nothing like the fortified building we'd abandoned, nothing like the condemned warehouse where we'd first emerged from the Prohibition Tunnel, and instead it was a surprisingly ordinary apartment in a high-rise building in the Loop, the kind of place where young professionals and wealthy retirees lived their normal, law-abiding lives without any idea that a Mafia Don and his mistress were hiding just a few floors above them, surrounded by enough weapons to stage a small coup and protected by men who moved through the shadows like ghosts. I sat on the edge of an expensive leather couch that probably cost more than most people's cars, still wearing my wine-stained gala dress that had somehow survived our escape through 2 separate tunnels and a car chase that I was trying very hard not to think about. And I watched as Dante paced back and forth across the hardwood floor while talking rapidly in Italian to various people on his secure phone, his voice tight with controlled tension as he orchestrated whatever plan was forming in that brilliant, dangerous mind of his. "I need you to understand something," Dante said when he finally ended his last call and came to sit beside me on the couch, and his hand immediately found mine, those fingers interlacing with mine in a grip that had become our lifeline over these past several hours of running and hiding and trying to survive. "The Morettis will send everyone, every resource they have, every connection they've cultivated over the past 3 decades of building their empire, and they'll go after your mother even though I've hidden her. They'll go after your friends from the hospital even though they have nothing to do with any of this. They'll tear apart your entire life looking for leverage they can use against us, because that's how this world works. How power is maintained, and challenges are answered in the only language that men like Don Moretti understand." My blood went cold again. That same terrible chill spreading through my veins that I'd felt in the car when he'd first mentioned my mother being a target. And I thought about Sarah from the volunteer coordinator's office who always brought me coffee when I was having a bad day. About Marcus, who worked security at the hospital and always had a joke ready to make the sick children laugh. About all the normal, innocent people whose only crime was existing in my orbit, and who were now potentially in danger because I'd fallen in love with a man whose world operated by rules that had nothing to do with morality or justice or any of the concepts that guided regular human interaction. But here's what they don't understand. What Don Moretti hasn't figured out yet in his rage over his daughter being slighted and his alliance being destroyed, Dante continued. and he turned my face toward his with gentle fingers under my chin, making me look into those dark eyes that had seen so much violence and blood, but that looked at me with such tenderness that it made my chest ache. I've been preparing for this possibility for months now, ever since the night I realized that I was falling in love with you, and that eventually I would have to choose between you and everything else I'd spent my entire life building. And I've been quietly moving assets into accounts that my father can't access, securing loyalties with men who are devoted to me personally, rather than to the Salvatore name, building a network that exists independent of the family structure so that when this moment came, I wouldn't be left completely vulnerable and defenseless. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me, trying to understand that he'd been planning for this war for months, while I had been lying in bed beside him, thinking our relationship was just a transaction, just a business arrangement that would end when he married Isabella, and moved on with his life according to the predetermined path that had been laid out for him since birth. "You've been planning to leave," I said slowly, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, filled with wonder and confusion, and a kind of awe that he had thought so far ahead, that he had been willing to sacrifice so much even before the crisis point had arrived. "You've been preparing to walk away from your family, from your empire, from everything you've ever known, and you've been doing it for months, while pretending that I meant nothing more to you than any other woman you might have paid for companionship." "I've been preparing to choose you," he corrected, and he pulled me closer, wrapped his arms around me in a way that made me feel protected, despite the fact that we were surrounded by danger on all sides, despite the fact that there were probably dozens of hitmen and mercenaries searching the city for us right now, with instructions to kill on sight. "And yes, I've been pretending that you were just a transaction, because I thought if I could maintain that fiction, if I could keep everyone believing that you were nothing more than a convenient arrangement, then maybe you would be safe from the consequences of my choices, from the targets that get painted on anyone I care about in this brutal world, where love is seen as weakness and attachments are vulnerabilities to be exploited." Before I could respond, before I could tell him that I loved him too, and had been loving him for months, while trying desperately to protect my own heart from the inevitable pain of losing him, there was a knock at the door. Not the aggressive pounding of enemies trying to break in, but a specific pattern of knocks that must have been some kind of code. And Luca entered looking exhausted and worried, and carrying what appeared to be a laptop computer and several thick folders of documents. "Isabella agreed to meet," he said without preamble, and his eyes flicked to me briefly, before returning to his brother with an expression that suggested he still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Still couldn't fully process that Dante had started a war over a woman he'd known for only 6 months. "But she's bringing Alessandro Romano with her, and her father doesn't know about the meeting, which means we have maybe a 2-hour window before he figures out what she's doing and sends people to stop her." "Alessandro Romano," I repeated, recognizing the name from news articles and from whispered conversations I'd overheard during my time with Dante. And I looked at Dante with questions in my eyes because I didn't understand why Isabella would bring another man to a meeting about her broken engagement, unless there was something I was missing, some piece of this puzzle that hadn't been explained to me yet. Dante's expression transformed into something that looked almost like satisfaction, like a chess player watching his opponent make exactly the move he'd been hoping for, and he squeezed my hand before standing and crossing to where Luca stood with the laptop and folders. "Alessandro Romano is the heir to the Chicago outfit, the family that controls the South Side territories, and has been trying to arrange a marriage alliance with the Morettis for the past 5 years, Dante explained, and he was opening the laptop and pulling up what looked like surveillance photos and financial records and detailed dossiers on various members of Chicago's criminal elite. And more importantly, he's been in love with Isabella since they were teenagers, has been watching her get engaged to me while knowing that she was never really mine to begin with, that this whole arrangement was about power and territory and strategic alliances rather than about any actual feelings between the people being forced to marry. Understanding crashed over me like a wave, sudden and complete and almost overwhelming in its implications, and I realized what Dante was suggesting, what kind of solution he thought might exist to this impossible situation we found ourselves in. "You think Isabella wants out?" I said, and I stood and crossed to where the two brothers were studying the laptop screen, and I could see photos of a beautiful dark-haired woman, Isabella, though I'd only seen her briefly at the gala before everything went to hell, standing close to a handsome man who looked at her with such obvious adoration that it was almost painful to witness. "You think she's just as trapped in this engagement as you were, just as desperate to escape an arranged marriage that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with family obligations and empire building." "I know she wants out," Dante corrected, and he pulled up what appeared to be intercepted text messages, private communications between Isabella and Alessandro that painted a picture of two people desperately in love, but unable to be together because of family politics and strategic considerations that were deemed more important than personal happiness. "I've had people monitoring her communications for the past month, ever since I realized that I was going to have to find a way to break the engagement without starting a war. And these messages tell me everything I need to know about how she really feels about marrying me versus how she feels about Alessandro Romano." "So you're suggesting what, exactly?" Luca asked, and he was looking at his brother with a mixture of admiration and concern, clearly impressed by the depth of planning that had gone into this, but also worried about whether it could actually work, whether they could pull off whatever scheme Dante was proposing without getting everyone killed. "That we arrange some kind of swap, that Isabella breaks the engagement publicly in a way that saves her reputation, while simultaneously announcing her intention to marry Alessandro. And somehow Don Moretti accepts this instead of burning Chicago to the ground in retaliation for the insult to his daughter and his family." "I'm suggesting," Dante said, and he pulled me back against his side, wrapped his arm around my waist in that possessive, protective gesture that was becoming second nature to him, "that we give Don Moretti something better than the alliance he thought he was getting with the Salvatores. That we show him how a marriage between Isabella and Alessandro would actually strengthen his position more than our arranged marriage ever could have, because the Romano family controls territories and resources and connections that would complement the Moretti Empire in ways that my family never could." The plan was audacious, brilliant, and possibly completely insane, requiring us to convince not just Isabella, but also Alessandro and eventually Don Moretti himself, that this alternative arrangement was not just acceptable, but actually preferable to the original plan. And I could see 1,000 ways it could go wrong, 1,000 variables that could shift and destroy everything before we even had a chance to present our case. But as I looked at Dante, at the determination burning in his eyes, and the set of his jaw that told me he was committed to this course of action, no matter how dangerous or unlikely its success, I realized that this was who he was at his core. Not just a mafia don, or a ruthless criminal, or a man who ruled through violence and fear, but also a strategist, a planner, someone who thought several moves ahead and found solutions where others saw only impossible obstacles. "When do we meet Isabella?" I asked, because what else could I do except trust the man I loved, the man who had sacrificed everything for me, the man who was now trying to find a way to end a war before it consumed us all. The meeting with Isabella happened in the most unlikely of places. A small Catholic church on the west side that Dante said had been in his family for generations. A sanctuary that supposedly operated under rules even older than the mob's code of silence, where violence was forbidden, and negotiations could happen under the watchful eyes of saints and the crucified Christ hanging above the altar. And I found myself walking down the center aisle of that church at 3 a.m, my heels clicking against marble floors that had witnessed probably a century's worth of confessions and prayers and desperate pleas for salvation from people who had committed sins far worse than falling in love with the wrong person. Isabella Moretti was already there when we arrived, sitting in one of the front pews with Alessandro Romano beside her, and she looked nothing like the cold society princess I'd glimpsed at the gala. Nothing like the perfect bride-to-be whose wedding had been plastered across every society page in Chicago for the past 3 months. and instead she looked exhausted and scared and somehow relieved, like she'd been waiting for this moment, for this conversation, for this chance to finally break free from the gilded cage that her father had built around her life. "You're either very brave or very stupid to come here," Isabella said when she saw me, and her voice was different than I'd expected, lacking the venom I'd heard when she'd confronted me at the gala, and instead carrying a kind of weary resignation that suggested she was too tired to maintain the facade of the offended fiancé. "My father has every soldier in his organization looking for you right now, has put out word through every family in Chicago that there's a bounty on your head, and you walk into a meeting with me like we're just going to have a civil conversation about the fact that you've been sleeping with my fiancé for the past 6 months. "I'm the woman who loves your fiancé," I replied, and I forced myself to walk forward with confidence I didn't entirely feel, forced myself to meet her eyes and not flinch away from whatever judgment or anger I might find there. "And you're the woman who doesn't love him, who has never loved him, who has been counting down the days until this wedding with about as much enthusiasm as someone facing a prison sentence." Her mask slipped then, just for a second, and I saw surprise flicker across her beautiful face before she composed herself again, before she rebuilt the walls that women in her position learned to construct from childhood, the armor that protected them from showing vulnerability or weakness or any emotion that could be used against them. "Excuse me?" she said, but her voice lacked conviction, lacked the outrage that should have accompanied such an accusation if it had been untrue. I pulled out my phone, showed her the photos that Dante's people had compiled, not the ones of her with Alessandro that could be explained away as innocent friendship, but the more recent ones, the ones that showed them together in moments that were decidedly not innocent, that showed her looking at Alessandro the way I looked at Dante, with love and longing and desperate hope written across every feature. "You're in love with Alessandro Romano," I said, and I kept my voice gentle because I realized that we weren't enemies, that we were actually allies in this strange situation. Two women trapped by circumstances and family obligations and the brutal mathematics of power that governed the world we'd both found ourselves in. "You have been for years, probably since you were teenagers if the intelligence Dante's gathered is accurate. And this marriage to Dante was never about love or even companionship. It was purely strategic. Your father's way of uniting the families and consolidating power. And you've been going along with it because you didn't think you had any other choice. Because women in our world don't get to choose love over duty." Isabella looked at Alessandro then, and something passed between them. Some silent communication that spoke of years of hidden feelings and stolen moments, and the kind of love that persists despite impossible odds. And when she turned back to me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears that she was clearly fighting to contain. "And what exactly are you proposing?" she asked, and her voice had softened, had lost the defensive edge and become something more genuine, more vulnerable, more human than the society princess persona she showed the world. Over the next hour, sitting in that church with dawn beginning to lighten the stained glass windows and cast colored light across our small group, we crafted a plan that was either brilliant or insane, or possibly both simultaneously. Isabella would publicly break the engagement, would call a press conference and announce that she couldn't marry a man who had been unfaithful, who had kept a mistress throughout their engagement, and she would do it in a way that salvaged her pride and her reputation while making Dante look like the villain who had wronged her. Then, after an appropriate period of time, maybe a week, maybe 2, just long enough for the initial scandal to die down, she would announce her engagement to Alessandro Romano, would frame it as finding true love in the aftermath of betrayal, would present it as a love story rather than a strategic alliance, even though it would actually accomplish both objectives simultaneously. "And your father?" I asked, because that was the crucial variable, the one person who could destroy this entire plan if he decided that his pride was worth more than the strategic advantages of the Romano alliance. Isabella smiled then, and it was cold and calculating, and reminded me that she was Don Moretti's daughter, that she had been raised in this world and understood its brutal rules just as well as any of the men who thought they controlled everything. My father wants power and territory and respect from the other families, she said, and her voice carried absolute certainty, the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the people around her to achieve her goals. The Romano family controls territories that the Salvatores never could have given him, has connections to political figures and legitimate businesses that would give my father's empire a veneer of respectability that he's always craved, and Alessandro's family has been seeking this alliance for years, but my father dismissed it because he thought the Salvatore name carried more prestige. The plan worked even better than we'd hoped, unfolding over the next 3 days, with a precision that suggested Dante had been right about Isabella being just as trapped and just as desperate as we were. She held her press conference looking perfectly devastated and beautifully wounded, told the assembled reporters that she'd discovered Dante's infidelity and couldn't possibly marry a man who had betrayed her trust so completely, and the society pages ate it up with headlines about the scorned bride and the faithless groom that painted her as a sympathetic figure, and Dante as exactly the kind of villain that people expected Mafia dons to be. Then, exactly 10 days later, she announced her engagement to Alessandro Romano in an exclusive interview that framed their relationship as a beautiful love story, as finding happiness in the aftermath of heartbreak, and the same reporters who had condemned Dante for his infidelity now celebrated Isabella for her resilience and her ability to find true love. And somehow, miraculously, Don Moretti accepted it all because his advisors had shown him the financial projections and territory maps and strategic analyses that proved Isabella had been right about the Romano alliance being superior to the Salvatore arrangement. 1 month after that terrible night in the wine cellar, Dante took me back to the estate, not to live there, not to reclaim his position as head of the Salvatore family, because he'd already formally stepped down from that role and handed control to Luca, but to see the wine cellar one final time, to walk through the space where everything had changed and where we'd both almost died. The cellar had been completely renovated. The burgundy stains that had spread across the floor, like spilled blood, now gone, replaced by new stone tiles that gleamed in the amber light. And every bottle that Marco had made me break in my panic had been replaced with vintages that cost even more, as if Dante was determined to erase every trace of that violent night except for the memories we carried. "I have a question for you," Dante said, and he pulled out a small velvet box that made my heart stop beating for several long seconds, and when he opened it, I saw a ring that took my breath away. A blood-red ruby surrounded by diamonds, fierce and unapologetic and nothing like the traditional engagement rings that society brides wore, but perfect for me. Perfect for us. Perfect for a love that had been forged in violence and danger and the kind of desperate choices that most people would never have to make. "I'm not asking you to be my mistress anymore, Arya," he said, and he dropped to one knee right there in the wine cellar. Right there in the place where I'd thought I would die, but where instead I'd discovered that I was loved beyond measure, beyond reason, beyond anything I'd thought possible. "I'm not even asking you to be my wife, though God knows I want that more than I want my next breath. Want to see you in white walking toward me down an aisle. Want to put my ring on your finger and tell the entire world that you're mine and I'm yours. But more than that, more than any title or legal document or social recognition, I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal, to stand beside me as we build something new. Something that has nothing to do with my family's empire, and everything to do with the life we want to create together." I pulled him to his feet before he could finish his speech, kissed him with all the love and terror and overwhelming gratitude that had been building in my chest since that night when he'd chosen me over everything else, and when we finally broke apart. I was crying and laughing and feeling like my heart might actually burst from the sheer intensity of what I felt for this dangerous, beautiful, complicated man who had turned his entire world upside down because he loved me. "Yes to all of it," I said, and my voice was shaking but certain, trembling but strong. Yes to being your partner, and your equal and your wife and whatever else you want me to be, because I love you with every piece of my broken, terrified, absolutely insane heart. And I would choose you again and again, would choose you 1,000 times over, even knowing everything it would cost. He slipped the ruby ring onto my finger, and it caught the light and blazed like fire, like blood, like all the passion and sacrifice and devastating choices that had brought us to this moment. And when he kissed me again, it tasted like wine and promises, and the future we were going to build together. No more wine cellars, though, I said against his lips, and I was smiling despite the tears still streaming down my face. I'm more of a penthouse suite kind of queen, something with a view and natural light and significantly fewer memories of almost being murdered. He laughed then. Really laughed in that way that I'd only heard a handful of times, the sound echoing off the walls where I'd once thought I'd die, but where instead I'd been reborn into something stronger, something fiercer, something that could survive anything as long as we survived it together. Done, he said, and he was still smiling as he swept me into his arms and carried me toward the stairs, toward the light, toward whatever future awaited us beyond the darkness of that cellar. Though I'm keeping this one, keeping it exactly as it is now, renovated and beautiful and cleaned of all the blood and wine as a reminder of what we survived, of what we're capable of when we choose love over everything else. A reminder of what? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer, could feel it in the way he held me, in the fierce possessiveness of his grip and the tenderness of his touch. That the best things in life are worth bleeding for, he said, and he carried me up the stairs and into the sunlight streaming through the mansion's windows, into a future that we would build together on our own terms. And that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, the mistress becomes the queen, and the empire you thought you wanted becomes nothing compared to the kingdom you build with the person you love.